Right, I believe we're ready to start. I'm just wondering that, yes, that's fine, that's better. The sound is better here now. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome everyone here to a very full room. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathy Willis. I'm the principal here at St Edmund Hall, but I'm also a Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Biology here at the University of Oxford. Now, this is our third in our conversations in environmental sustainability seminars, and we set these up really to have a conversation. The very word conversation is in there. It's not supposed to be a lecture, it's supposed to be a debate around a particular topical question. And so how we've set this up is to ask our speakers to all address the same question. And the question today, as you've probably heard and you've read, is how can we ensure that no one is left behind when addressing global environmental challenges, and particularly in developing countries. Now, this is a really important question, and this is because often when you talk about developing countries, people say, well, the problems are historical. We, the North, the global North, have created the issues, and it's now the global South that's having to deal with those problems. And that is absolutely right, and we need to be thinking about a case for a just transition and building resilience. But I think we also need to see it in a slightly different light. And that's because over half of our current consumption-based CO2 emissions are from LDCs. And I think a lot of people don't know that fact. And if I just give you one example, if you compare the share of electricity production by source in the European Union last year, you will see that nuclear and gas, nuclear in particular, obviously a renewable, or at least not an emitter, counted for 40% of the energy, with coal burning only accounting for 15% of that contribution towards electricity. Now compare that to Africa, this is actually in 2022, where 40% of the 40% of the electricity source came from coal burning. So you've got this large amount of emissions coming out from the global South, but also we've got this funding gap, massive funding gap, which we will hear about today, to renewables in these emerging markets. If we want people to keep going and to join in, we have to ensure that there is funding to support that transition to renewables. And we also have to ensure that the technological innovations that enable people and enable countries to keep up are also in line. Whereas far too often those technological innovations and the funding towards those is very much for the rich companies in the global North. So there's many issues here, but hopefully today we're going to see some solutions to these issues, and we're going to hear about different approaches that have been brought together in order to address this question about how on earth do we ensure that everyone is moving in the same direction and at the same place, that no one is left behind. So we've got four wonderful speakers, and I'm deeply appreciative to all of you for coming today. We've got Bayo Owolabi, who's the principal and energy specialist at Boston Consulting Group. We've got Anousheh Ansari, who is a high-tech entrepreneur and currently the CEO of the XPrize Foundation. Really listen to this one. This is absolutely innovative and exciting. It's a large competition to solve humanity's greatest challenges. We've got Khalid Abdelgadir, and Khalid is one of our own. Khalid is on a very, very prestigious Weidenfeld Hoffman Scholarship, and he's actually doing an MBA this year at the Side Business School, but he's here for 1 year, and he set up his own company in Africa to address the issues of ensuring no one's left behind, right at the other end, at the smallholder farmer level. And finally, and last but not least, we have Deirdre Cooper, who's the head of sustainability equity at 91, and a real leading voice in understanding and committing to sustainable investing. So with all four speakers, each speaker is going to talk for about 12 to 15 minutes. You can ask that if there's time, if they talk beyond 15 minutes, there's no time. If there's time, there'll be one question at the end of when they were speaking. And then at the end of the session of those 4 speeches, then all 4 will come up onto this platform, and that will be the opportunity to have a real conversation with hopefully questions coming in from the audience. So without further ado, could I ask Bayo to come up and start the proceedings? And Bayo, I believe your slides are up here, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. I'm an alumni of Exeter College and the Side Business School, so always good to be back in Oxford. I focus on energy at BCG. A lot of my work is around decarbonization solutions and how we get the world to transition to low forms of low carbon ways of powering our economies. But for the talk today, I wanted to spotlight examples from sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm from Nigeria originally, and I thought it was topical to almost illustrate by a case of extremes 2 sort of big things. So I chose examples that are informed by the work that the Boston Consulting Group has been doing supporting governments in Africa, looking at this topic of environmental sustainability and transition. And I chose topics that sort of covered 2 ends of the spectrum. So energy transition on one end, using South Africa as a case study. South Africa is actually responsible for a lot of that coal production, coal emissions that Kathy mentioned, if you look at the profile of Africa's emissions. So how do we get what is one of the most coal-intensive economies in the world to transition to a more renewable, sustainable form of power in the economy? And then on the other side, Lagos State. In this case, I've chosen more of an adaptation and resilience angle to the example, partly because we are so off track. And we have to start thinking how we protect the millions of people who are going to be most affected by the impacts of climate change. So let's jump straight in then with the South Africa one. So this example is South Africa's JET-P program, which some of you may be familiar with. The idea was to transition what is essentially the 13th largest emitter globally towards a more renewable-based way of powering the economy. This page here is a snapshot for South Africa, and I want to call out a couple of things. So population-wise, South Africa is 60 million people, not the largest in Africa. So DRC, Nigeria, Egypt have far larger populations. But South Africa historically has been the most advanced economy by any way that you cut it. So the 60 million people on a per capita basis actually have the highest emissions in Africa, surpassed only, I think, by Libya. A lot of the problem comes from the electricity sector and the fact that it's 80 to 90% coal-driven. Beyond electricity generation, where South Africa is the leading in terms of installed capacity in Africa, the industrial sector, so if you think about the petrochemicals or the gas to liquids sector, is also a main driver. Because of a history of embargoes on oil, South Africa has a higher dependence on coal as a feedstock for generating chemicals or even things like diesel and petrol. And they are kind of like one of the world's leader in Fischer-Tropsch technology that uses gasified coal to generate chemicals. And so for these reasons, you have a carbon intensity 2x that of G20 countries. So not really what you think about when you think about an African country and emissions intensity. Compounding the problem is the fact that these sectors also drive a lot of the employment in the economy, and we are already dealing with an unemployment rate of 35% in 2022. So you think, how do we move away from coal with all the jobs that will be at risk, so 60% in mining, for example, without exacerbating the problems that we have around unemployment? How do we meet what is already a shortfall in electricity generation, etc., if we move to accelerated retirement of coal plants, which is something that comes up quite a lot? I think the other thing to flag that's not necessarily on the page is that if you look at South Africa's export markets, the 50% by value of the exports that South Africa does is with countries that now have a net zero target and are starting to look very closely at imported emissions. So if you take the EU was a major trading partner with South Africa, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, went into place late last year. That puts a carbon price at EU levels on the carbon content of imports that are moving into the EU and creates a risk for South African imports. So BCG supported over a period of 3 years the South African government and coalition of governments in looking at what are sustainable pathways that South Africa could take and what could those look like and how do we finance it, because that's a huge part of the problem. I would highlight some of the key messages from that study. I mean, one of the big impacts of the study was giving South Africa the confidence to update its nationally determined contributions, for example, to say, look, if we get the financing, actually we're willing to go a lot further than we previously committed to in terms of emissions reduction. So it's a given that a shift in energy mix is required for South Africa. The great thing is because power is a huge part of the problem, renewables can play a role there. And the great thing about renewables is if you get the cost of capital right, it actually outcompetes on a levelized cost of electricity basis coal, right? And then if you add to the fact that a lot of South Africa's coal fleet is old, the case for accelerating the replacement of these and using those same sites for renewable power, where you already have the grid connection, is there. So a lot of it is going to aim in renewables, deploying renewables at a rate that South Africa has never done before. And that could get you 60% of the way. The rest of it comes down to other levers like electrification, like nature-based solutions, etc. What's it going to cost? 320 billion through to 2050. It's a lot of money. But I assure you, part of the work that we did was thinking about how do we double-click on that bucket of money and start breaking down the funding that's needed into different tranches that different types of partners can get involved with. And then, like I mentioned before, in terms of just transitions, jobs and protecting jobs and livelihoods that are linked to fossil is a huge part of making sure that this all hangs together. So like I mentioned, renewables are a huge part of this, and as you can see here, power is the biggest lever to address first. And as such, a lot of the activity and the financing that is being raised under the JETP program is really looking at power as the first lever to decarbonize through to 2030. Closely linked is the petrochemical industry and the potential for South Africa to be a net exporter of hydrogen, green hydrogen specifically. Actually, the IEA has a very interesting map that shows across the world what's the levelized cost of hydrogen that you could get. And you can see that places in North Africa and in South Africa are huge parts of that. Whenever we talk renewables, grids are super important. So again, 2x the grid size, 5 times the renewables capacity in terms of scale. When it comes to other levers as well, we looked at transport. So actually you see South Africa has a very wide urban spread. And actually one of the ways that we identified that you can solve the problem is to densify. So develop along strong transport corridors, and then you grain the stock that you use to deliver the transport. And this is another sort of key lever in terms of solutions to chase. I spoke about the financing briefly, the numbers 320 billion to 2050, but I think what's more interesting is the fact that when you break the numbers apart, 60% of it actually can pay for itself. So there are projects that can attract the right rates of returns for commercial financing. Now, the 40% that's left, we'll have to do blended finance for a portion of it and concessional grants for a large part of it. And what you can see is that with the JETP program, it's already attracted 8.5 billion, almost 10 billion at the end of last year. And very interesting is that 8% of that is already committed on a grant basis. So that last bucket that is not chasing any returns is really dedicated to solving the just transition part of the equation. I looked at the UK government report on how this is progressing, and what's great actually is that 50% of the money on the grant basis is already committed, with another 35% linked to projects that are being evaluated. So rather than what we saw before where you have the commitments without the money being there, this is a positive thing, I have to say. And then all of these investments are expected to be catalytic. So the range of what we expect to be crowded in is between 3 to 9%, with an average of 5x whatever is committed already. Quick notes on upskilling and jobs. So moving people away from coal mining and jobs related to coal production of electricity into this sort of build out of renewables, potentially green hydrogen production, is going to be absolutely key. In terms of scale, we're talking about 10,000 people trained annually in jobs that are immediately relevant to the transition. And a lot of that grant financing that I mentioned on the previous page is actually looking at that. How can we provide the jobs and the skills that are needed for a new economy? It's been a quick whiz through the South Africa example. Let me just touch on Lagos very quickly, changing tact. Like I said, this is more about adaptation and resilience. Actually, it has nothing to do with green or energy at all. When we think about the impact of sea level rise, we tend to think about small island states. They've been extremely vocal in making the case that we don't have countries if we don't do something about this. But if you look at the numbers in terms of population at risk, we have about 3 billion people living in coastal areas, so 2 billion, 2.1 in near coastal areas, and another 0.9 on the coast themselves. These 3 billion people are at severe risk from sea level rise. In Nigeria, Lagos is a classic example of that. It's only 0.4 of Nigeria's landmass, but it actually has more than 10% of the population, and it's an absolute powerhouse when it comes to the economy. This map, blues and light greens are sort of low-lying areas under 2 meters. The red is high-lying areas, and the bulk of people in Lagos live in the places at risk. The blowout that I did is where I used to have a flat actually in Lagos, and you can see it's exactly at 0 meters. And even though it was a top floor flat that had no risk of flooding itself, there's a real chance that it would be a stranded asset because there would be no way to get to the house. So it's part of the reasons why it's no longer my flat and it now belongs to someone else. But, jokes apart, when I was a young engineer, let me touch on this real quick. I mean, we did some modeling in terms of what's the cost at stake if you had massive shocks anytime between now and 2050 in terms of physical, social, and economic. It's 27 to 34 billion. That's about a third of the GDP of Lagos. That's about 12 times the spend of the government in a year. So we have to do something now to avoid issues like this. So the government's been thinking about intervention. So how do we make the infrastructure a lot more resilient? How do we make communities more resilient? How do we improve our ability to anticipate risk and improve our crisis response? Similar to the South Africa example, we've been very granular in terms of thinking about what projects need to happen and what sort of financing would they need. And you can see here, again, things around avoided loss, protection of business assets. These are projects that could have the returns for themselves and they don't need concessional finance. Things like carbon market projects, GHG offsets fall in that category, as well as private-public partnerships, one of which I will highlight. And then you have things like just the raw infrastructure for things like drains, right, that can actually deal with that sort of low-lying elevation. You're not going to get a lot of returns on that concessional finance, and then things that just require grants. I wanted to highlight one quick case study. This is not an endorsement. Let me be the first person to say that, because if you Google this case study, you will find people who have glowing reviews of what it's done and people who absolutely hate it in terms of like what it does in terms of inequality, what it does in terms of ecological impacts, etc. So it's more to highlight the PPP aspect of how we can think about the solutions. So when I was a young engineer working in doing my internship in Lagos, the picture that you have at the top there is really the reality of getting to work every morning. If you have an ocean surge, the sea is on the road. Like literally, when my dad was a student in school, there was a beach. When I was a student, there was no beach. It was the sea and the road. And the reality was that people were already moving, relocating from that stretch of road. And Victoria Island, which is the nerve center of Lagos commercial activity, was under threat. Climate change was not the cause for this, for the ocean erosion. Historically, it was more down to the construction decisions that were made in terms of making the Lagos ports, the patterns of ocean flow, etc. But when you couple a situation like this with sea level rise, then you see what is at stake. So what was very interesting about the solution that the government took, so for many years they'd done sand replenishment. What the government decided to do this time was to just deal with the problem holistically by building a seawall that was resilient to, modeled storms and sea level rise that Lagos could encounter. They couldn't afford to pay for that. So what was done was to give this as a concession. So essentially the government gives a concession. You build a seawall, you sand fill the land between the seawall and the existing Lagos state boundaries, and that is land that is then available for private developers to sell, which solves the other problem that Lagos has, which is tiny landmass, lots of people. And so this is an example of thinking innovatively about the problem and thinking about how we can raise financing to solve it. Just to close, financing dominates the conversation. That is true, but leaving no one behind also requires us to think really about capacity building, giving the ability to our governments to think through how do you create interesting designs that actually attract the financing, both in the South Africa and the Lagos examples that I showed. Technology collaborations, we talked about in innovation. When we think about carbon markets, people can get their head around forest protection projects in Africa, but what about direct air capture plants in Kenya, paid for by Western commitments? Is that something that we can stomach? Trade access, I spoke about green hydrogen previously. But also, just to close, protecting the headroom on the carbon budget for these economies to manage the transition at a better pace is extremely important. And that requires the West to stick to its own timelines. I think under the IEA scenarios I was looking at earlier today, in most scenarios that you look at, Africa's contribution on a cumulative basis stays below 5% to the problem, in most scenarios, right? Whether they move extremely fast or extremely slow. So that's the scale of what the contribution is, and sticking to the timelines where the biggest problems are is absolutely important. Thank you.
So I think, thank you for that fantastic first talk. I'm going to stand away from this mic. I think we'll move straight on though. Yeah. So Anousheh, if you'd like to take the stage. And Dr. Anousheh Ansari, I should mention, I didn't say before, has under her CV, she's also an astronaut. So if anyone wants to ask about that later, please do. And so Anousheh is going to be talking about her work on the XPrize Foundation. Anousheh.
Great. Thank you. So I thought that in order to introduce XPrize, I'll start with a video that will describe what we do. But my presentation is not about a specific solution, but an approach to scaling many solutions that can help us really achieve the equitable, sustainable future we want for everyone. So if you would play the video, please.
The XPrize Foundation runs incredible large-scale competitions around the world that set very clear, measurable, objective goals. The first person to build, demonstrate this capability wins the prize money, and the world gets the benefits.
Anousheh Ansari is the CEO of XPrize, which sponsors competitions to solve the world's challenges.
Competitions and prizes can actually bring innovation to solve not just any problem, but really big, challenging problems.
I think we're about setting a high bar. You want to set a goal for people that's inspiring, but it's also hard.
When we're designing an XPrize, we're looking for something that is audacious and achievable.
Goals that are far beyond where the industry is.
problems that the markets have failed to solve.
To help people really dig into their imaginations. Creativity is everywhere.
We don't care who you are or where you come from. If you're able to accomplish this task, you win, and that's it.
1,000 years ago, it was only the kings and queens who could do anything on a national or regional level. Today, it's all of us. Anyone who's truly passionate, driven by a massively transformative purpose, can go and make a change in the world.
We are leveraging the genius of people from all over the world.
The tinkers, the entrepreneurs, the engineers.
People who are not satisfied with the way things are and know that it can be better.
It's all around hopefulness. It's all about collaboration.
Prizes are not about competition, they're about impact. And there is no better and more powerful tool to do it, in our opinion, than a prize itself.
I've seen things go from a paper plane to an actual spaceship.
We've seen private spaceflight revolution.
$300 million invested in the lunar economy. Over 10 million kids integrated into STEM education.
Technology that increased the rate of cleaning up oil spills.
Technology to help keep people safe.
To make sure everyone is healthy.
Feeding people, educating people, cleaning the air, exploring the oceans or space. We're changing what people believe is possible.
We want to have an ideal future, and it's up to us to build it.
So no matter what challenge you want to solve, join us on this journey. Just don't be satisfied doing nothing.
So our mission is to build an equitable, abundant future for all, and we can argue that we have an abundant future, it's just not equitable. So we really emphasize on equity, and that's part of, equity principle is part of our prize design. So when we look at designing a competition, we really look at how the technologies and innovation will impact the society at large and different parts of the world to make sure that we account for that in our prize design. What we've done is, as you heard, we look at how we can really push the boundaries of what's possible. We have a lot of projects around the globe, some at this university, where there are innovations coming in the labs and at small scale. But the size of the problems we have and the urgency of addressing some of these issues requires us to push these solutions out of the labs and push them to scale up. So that's something that involves risk, and that's something we're good at, pushing the envelope and pushing the boundaries and bringing capital that is risk tolerant and a methodology that makes that capital sort of comfortable with the risks involved with those technologies to invest in those companies. We also believe that good innovation can come from anywhere in the world. So we truly believe in democratizing innovation, and that's why we really reach across the globe to bring innovative solution to some of these big challenges. And we seek partnerships and creating an ecosystem of support for our teams and entrepreneurs. We work in 7 domains: climate and energy, biodiversity, food, waste, water, health, learning and society, exploration, and deep tech is the 7 domains. But as you can see, many of them are about sustainability and creating a sustainable future for all. We've launched $300 million worth of prizes. We're launching some more. But it's not just the prizes, because that prize money gets leveraged about 33 times and brings additional capital to invest in those solutions. So the reason a lot of teams really love participating in our competitions is the fact that we really shine a big light on the problem. So we create awareness about the problems, but also we shine a big light on the entrepreneurs who participate in the competition. So the competitions are between 3 to 5 years, and during that timeline, not only we support them and connect them with sources of capital, but we really highlight how their approach can be revolutionary in solving these problems. That's why the teams who are competing in an XPrize receive 800% more funding than companies who are outside of the competition. And that's because we apply a lot of rigor and testing that makes the investment community more comfortable with the type of technologies that are coming out of it. We are very global. We have, so far in our competitions, have about 10,000 teams. The teams can be a group of 3 or 4 people or a company of 20 or 30. And they participate from 140 countries around the globe. And because of our local presence and the fact that we got our start in the United States, US has the majority of the teams, but we have teams, as you can see, all these dots represent companies who participate in our competitions. And we're working on through establishing physical presence to increase that participation and create local ecosystems that will support the teams. These are some of the examples that I picked as active prizes where we see opportunities for participation from all over the world, and we have seen teams from everywhere in the world participate. So this is an area of sustainability that doesn't get talked about as much. But alternative sources of protein is an important part of our sustainable future. As our population grows, and we know the current way we supply meat actually is very intensive on not only greenhouse gases, but also on our water supply, which is also becoming scarce. So finding alternative source of protein, which is cell-based, is one of the approaches we're promoting. And we're focusing on white meat because a lot of the different parts of the world actually consume chicken and fish more than they consume red meat. So this is to create a cell-based alternative to a fillet of chicken or a fillet of fish at the same value, at the same cost, at the same nutritional value, and through sustainable energy sources. Again, we emphasize the criteria for winning the prize on sustainable energy sources and as well as the cost, because we want to make sure that it's accessible to the entire world. This competition particularly will be coming to an end in June, and we will be announcing the winners, and we're very excited about what we see the teams have accomplished so far. Another one is a rainforest competition. So in this competition, we're trying to identify biodiversity at different layers of the rainforest, and by identifying, creating ways to protect it. Now, in this competition specifically, we have been working very closely with the indigenous people who live in these environments, and their livelihood depends on it. So they're very excited about this opportunity because they see this as a way of creating more attention on why we need to preserve these precious resources. So as you all know, South America and also Africa is a great, they have some of the largest rainforests, which are also a carbon sink for the world. So this is also a competition that we'll be awarding this year, and very excited about it. The finals will be in Brazil. The next prize I want to talk about is also another contributor to our CO2 emissions, which is a cause of climate change. And wildfires have been really spreading all over the world, and frankly, there is no reason why we can't do a better job at detecting them. So space-based and ground-based detection is what we're trying to promote here. But not only detection, we're looking for early detection and notification of proper resources to be able to put out a small fire before they become large fires. And we're excited, Minderoo Foundation from Australia and PG&E Moore Foundation are sponsoring this prize, and it's going to go for another 2 years before we announce the winners. Last but not least, and I'll dive a little bit deeper on this one, is our CO2 removal at scale. This is at gigaton scale. And it's important because when we launched this prize, the world still thought that we can just manage our greenhouse issue with switching to renewable. It has become now known and apparent that that's not enough, and at the rate we're deploying this technology, it's not fast enough, and we need to actually be removing CO2 from the atmosphere, and not just remove CO2, we have to remove it at gigaton level. So this prize particularly was inspired by the fact that in 2015, the Paris Agreement came out and said, okay, we're going to switch to renewables and we're going to reduce emissions. But what we saw that actually after the announcement and agreement, the emissions actually started increasing. So it became apparent that removal is actually a necessary need. Now, gigaton level is what we need to remove annually by 2050 if we want to stay. And I mean, I think everyone's given up on 1.5 degrees, so we're not targeting 2 degrees. But gigaton is a very large number. Just to give a perspective to it, 100 million African elephants is equivalent to a gigaton CO2. And what we look at is solutions that cut across 4 different areas: direct carbon capture from the atmosphere, ocean-based solutions, land-based, natural-based solutions, as well as mineralization and rocks. The prize was launched in 2021, and after the prize was launched, we saw actually some early investors in carbon removal and carbon credit, and this actually inspired the rest of the investors to come in. We unfortunately, we've seen a little bit of a shift from additional investment because of what has happened in terms of some of these carbon credits actually did not deliver what they promised. But that's why the work we're doing is more important. So right now, the solutions that are out there, only a small percentage come from novel solutions. So our approach to it is to actually, we don't believe there is a silver bullet. We believe we need a combination of solutions. So our approach is to number up the different types of innovation and solution and then push them to scale up. And that's what we've been doing. There is, right now, we had 3,000 enter. We're at the midpoint of the competition, and there's still about 1,300 teams still competing. These are the areas they're active in. And we saw that when we launched the competition, how it has actually impacted and increased the number of startups who entered and started building companies to address this specific problem. We see a good mix of the solutions that have come out of these. The 330 teams are the teams that are actively building solutions, and we see that we'll have a chance to win the competition. And they have very different approaches in terms of how they're going to solve the problem. But we're very encouraged by the results we see, and we hope that some of these teams will be, the ones who actually reach gigaton. We've been looking at our testing coming up, and only during the testing, these solutions will remove 2 times the annual CO2 that's being removed today by novel solutions. So just in 1 year of testing, we're going to do more than what has been done in the past. So this is how we're approaching sustainable environmental solutions.
So another very inspiring talk at a really global scale. It's very, very exciting. I've already introduced Khalid, but let me introduce Deirdre. Deirdre is the head of sustainable equity at 91, and she's going to be talking about the work they've been doing on sustainable investing. Deirdre.
Not at all. And thank you so much, Kathy. So as you said, I head sustainable equity at 91. 91 is a global asset manager, jointly headquartered between Cape Town and London. I think we're unusual in that we're probably the only truly global asset management business that was born in the African continent. And I think that does give us a slightly different perspective on sustainability challenges. And that's part of the reason why our focus has always been on thinking about sustainability, not just from the perspective of Europe and the US, but from thinking about how you deal with these issues in emerging markets, and thinking very particularly about today's topics, which is, how do we fund the transition in emerging markets? And that is our number one advocacy topic. And that's because we experience it real life. I think Bayo did a great job of explaining how South Africa is probably the one country in the world that has the most both physical climate risk, in that, and we've seen that where our office is based in Cape Town. Cape Town almost ran out of water 3 or 4 years ago. So that's the impact of physical climate risk. You've seen huge risk to harvest, but also massive transition risk. This hugely coal-reliant economy, and that drives employment. That's just really, really difficult to transition. So that, of course, means the topic is a little more acutely felt. But it's also because if you think climate risk is investment risk, and we definitely still think climate risk is investment risk, it's not necessarily the case across every asset manager anymore, then actually you have to think about emerging markets. And Kathy talked at the beginning about the sort of climate equity debate, and you can see that in this chart. The grey and the burgundy colours are Europe and the US. So cumulative emissions are obviously what matters. It's the stock, it's the balance sheet that matters, not the flow. And the cumulative emissions are dominated by Europe and the US. But then actually you start to look at China, who's by far and away the biggest driver of growth more recently. And then you look at other emerging markets. And actually where we are now is about 60% of all emissions are in emerging markets, and 90% of the growth in emissions are in emerging markets. So if you care about climate risk and you think it's a big problem and something we should address, then you really need to look, you need to focus all your attention on emerging markets, because that's where all the emissions growth is coming from. So why is that? Well, it's probably 3 reasons. The first and most important is that emissions are almost perfectly correlated with GDP. So the correlation between emissions growth and GDP growth is about 93%. Which is also an interesting thing to keep in mind when you think about transition risk. So transitioning to the net zero basically means taking the global economy and breaking it and making it again in a completely different way. The second reason, which is part of the issue, but it's certainly not all of it, but you'll hear a lot about it, is that Europe doesn't make a lot of things anymore. We've outsourced our emissions to emerging markets, and that's part of the reason. But it's definitely not the biggest reason. And then the last one, and this goes to Kathy's comment on, why has Europe shut down coal so much more quickly than, say, South Africa has? And the reason is cost of capital. And that's particularly important for the power sector. So renewable energy is much more sensitive to the cost of capital than fossil fuel is, because your operating cost is almost zero. Your wind is free, your sun is free, but you got to invest a lot of money up front in order to build those assets. So that means that 10 plus years ago, it became cheaper to build new power from renewables in Europe than it was from fossil fuel. It's now even cheaper than running existing fossil fuel plants. That only very, very recently became the case in most of the African continent, in India. Still not the case in Indonesia, it's not the case in Russia, because you have very cheap domestic gas and coal reserves, and that means your natural economic decision is different in different parts of the world. So we need to keep that in mind. And that's really important, because really what do we need to do to address that climate challenge? Well, we need to spend money. And I'll start with the good news. The good news is we are spending money. So I started Morgan Stanley's Clean Tech Investment Banking Group in Europe in 2006. And back then, the world was investing about between $200 and $300 billion every year in climate finance. 2023 will be an all-time record. So this number is actually out of date. I think the last number from the IEA on 23, it's about 1.8 trillion. Was invested last year globally in climate. And that was absolutely dominated by Europe, by the US, and by China. China's by far the biggest global investor in climate, in renewable energy, in electric cars, in decarbonization. And they've driven much of that massive acceleration that we've seen recently. So sort of continuing on that good news point, actually, if you look at the compound annual growth rate of investment in climate in Europe, in the US, in China, and you apply that going forward, which is a big assumption to make because you start hitting law of large numbers, but they're already pretty large numbers, you're actually pretty much in line with a net zero scenario. So the net zero scenario, that 1.8 becomes somewhere between 4 and 10 trillion. Obviously there's lots of assumptions. It depends on which source you used. I think the right answer is definitely in the top half. It's somewhere between 6 and 10 trillion of investment required. but you're actually kind of on track. And then you have a huge market failure. And the huge market failure is emerging markets ex-China. So in emerging markets ex-China, if you look at the rate of growth in investment in climate finance over the last couple of years, there isn't one. It's negative. Been slightly decreasing over the last 4 or 5 years. COVID really hurt. It really hurt fiscal situations at government. It made investment really difficult. So current transition financing, EMs ex-China is about 150 billion. Needs to be somewhere between, I think it's probably closer to $1 trillion. So you're about 1/10 of the level you need to be. Elsewhere, you're sort of 1/4. So this is what we need to worry about when we worry about whether or not we're going to solve the climate challenge. And then let's have a think about where the 150 billion's coming from. About half of it is domestic, and the transition is much easier for emerging markets that have domestic savings pools. So that's a big part of the reason why, China has sped ahead, because the transition in China is entirely domestically funded. It's funded by the government, it's funded by SOEs, it's funded by large Chinese banks. For emerging markets that don't have domestic capital pools, that's your big problem. So then you're reliant on developed market funding, and you can see about 14 billion of it comes from the private sector, so that's large pension funds, institutional investors, etc., and about 66 billion of it is public financing. So this is exactly what Bayo was talking about in South Africa. You have this, you have this 10 billion that the West has committed. I'm not sure it's already flown, but it's definitely committed. And we have hope that it'll move in that direction. But that public bucket isn't going to be enough to solve the problem. I mean, I think we all know that. We think about the politics that we see here in the UK, just generally, there's no appetite to grow 66 billion to 600 billion to help fund the transition in emerging markets. We are going to have to tap private sector money. And then we can also think about some good news. The good news is actually the projects are pretty good. So we run at 91 something called the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund. Been investing money in infrastructure in the African continent for well over a decade. And I'm going to ask a question, actually, have a guess. What's the default rate we've seen on those projects? And before you answer, I'll tell you about some of them. We've put 21 million into Kigali Water in Rwanda. We've put 35 million into a solar project in Kenya, 40 megawatts of solar PV in Kenya, and 35 million into a 46 megawatt biomass plant in the Ivory Coast. So that's a snapshot of the kind of projects. Anyone got any idea over the 15 years what's the default rate that we've seen on these projects? 2%. So there's just a massive difference between actual risk and perceived risk. So I go back and we talk to these large institutional investors and pension funds, and we say, well, you're really interested in sustainability. It's all over your website. You're absolutely sustainable development goal aligned. Would you like to think about investing long-term project finance in solar projects in Rwanda? And the answer is, well, our EM weight is currently 5%, and we don't actually cover that country, and it isn't in our risk process, and we'd really love to think about it, and why don't you come back and, talk to us another day, but it gets filed under too difficult. So I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done on socializing perceived risk versus real risk, something I work on. I'm on the Finance Advisory Board at the IEA. They have a wonderful resource called the Cost Capital Lab, which you should all look at, which highlights many of these challenges. There's also a great report called Funding the Transition in Emerging Markets that came out about 1.5 years ago, which has all of this great data. And then I think we, as stakeholders in all these pension funds, really need to question on sustainable allocations. 90% of the money that's run aligned with sustainable development goals is invested in developed countries. If you actually look at those sustainable development goals, about 80% of the money needs to go in developing countries. So there is a real disconnect. We run an environmental strategy, a listed equity environmental strategy, and we're the only one across all our peers that has much weight in emerging markets. Most of them exclude emerging markets because emerging markets are high carbon, which is 100% true. We've just talked about that. They're much higher carbon. They're much more reliant on coal, but they're also where all the investment needs to go to decarbonize. And I think unless we can unlock, and I think this is great, I'll stop here and maybe allow us to move to the panel once we've heard about your work on the ground in Africa. But unless we can grow that 14 billion to something that is, many, many tens or even 100 times bigger than that, we're not going to address that climate challenge. And that's probably the main reason why I think all those pension funds and endowments need to do this, because the climate risk to their broader portfolio is so big, right? Think about that correlation between GDP and emissions. So there's a huge potential negative impact on all of those assets that you hold elsewhere if you don't invest here to decarbonize. And then you end up with a sort of problem of the commons, right? So everyone says, well, that's probably true, so I should allocate. But if I do it and no one else does it, well then what's the point in me taking the risk? And I think that's the conversation that we need to start to have, and then we need to highlight more of those great projects that Bayo highlighted at the beginning and start to get that institutional capital flowing.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And then finally, last but not least, Khalid.
Thank you, everyone. This is going to be more of a story. My journey from being an engineer to a social entrepreneur. So I only have 5-6 slides, and I'm going to share my experience, hoping that it gives you some sort of inspiration and brings the discussion on how can we make actual practical things on the grassroots level. So, So just a brief background about myself. I was born in Saudi. My father was an expat. And then I was moving between Sudan and Saudi I used to go to Sudan, which is my own country, during the vacation. And then when I was 10 years old, I moved back to Sudan and continued my studies and done mechanical engineering. And I think living between those two locations have changed the way I see the world by living between two different cultures, two different geographies, two different continents. And while I was doing my engineering studies, I got very passionate because at that time it was a very hot topic about when people talked about the climate change and the emerging renewable energy. And I was kind of dreaming about a future career in doing renewable energy projects. And then when I was graduating, the economy was not the best, and at the same time I was having a residence back in Saudi. So I moved there and I worked in the private sector. And to be honest, it was, maybe for some people it would be a good job, but for me I wasn't happy because I felt like it didn't have any value for me. And I wanted to do something with a value. And that was the start of my entrepreneurship journey, because I made the decision to go back to Sudan and do something that has a social value for the community. And at that time I didn't know what to do, but I knew that I wanted to do something with a purpose. So I wanted to start with working with the agriculture, which is the potential of the country. I'll give you more about this journey, but I also wanted to give you some information about what I am doing now at the moment, because when I started this startup, I found myself becoming a social entrepreneur, and now I'm doing an MBA to continue growing as a social entrepreneur and also grow and also try to make something larger than the thing I tried to do. And I'm also very honored to be awarded a scholarship, which is very hard to get. And also, without that scholarship, I wouldn't be able to come here and study at Oxford. The scholarship is named Wonderful Hoffman, And also I would like to thank my colleagues at Edmund Hall, which is also a contributor to this scholarship, besides two gentlemen who are Ben Barnett and Shoaib Chaudhry, who are two entrepreneurs. So I thank them all, and I thank the college and the university and the scholarship. So why did I wanted to start working in addressing the post-harvest losses? Because this is an actual picture I took through my phone, and when I started, I was just out of curiosity. I felt like I wanted to create a solution that's based on engineering, because I wanted to apply the thing I told you about first, which is trying to make a solution that's climate smart and also helps the people. But when I was doing the market research, I came across this place, and that was a market in Kenya, because I was exploring the Kenyan and Sudanese market as well at the same time. So when I saw this picture, I got really shocked that the problem is way bigger than I was actually thinking. I was very young, maybe I was naive because I didn't have, I was kind of dreaming, and when I saw that, I felt like this is a very big problem, and I started talking to the farmers and also the traders in the market. So that was the trigger of the start of that journey. And then I felt like I needed to do more work by talking to more people and also doing more work on the ground. And I still remember there was one statement I got from a farmer when I told him, what if I just give you a solution that helps you to store and you don't need to pay for petrol, electricity, or diesel, or whatever? He told me I may not be able to use that solution because some people cannot even afford to wait for a few days because you're gonna ask me to pay for that service. And then I felt it doesn't work if I'm just approaching it from a technical perspective. I have now to shift my mindset towards doing a more entrepreneurial, more business thing, and that was the start. So that's a picture from that waste, we started working with a farmer, and this is a farm in Sudan. They used to plant tomatoes, and tomatoes is one of the most perishable type of vegetables. And that was just the start when we were doing the MVP and the work on the ground. And we could witness that we helped the farmers to get, and actually we started also helping the other people, because normally the process is from the farm. They are approached by brokers or middle people who come just to tell them I have a buyer. So they used to do very traditional way, which is sometimes brings more losses, because as you are trying to store and aggregate the crop, you lose it on the ground and you get exposed to on the sun, so we keep on losing. So for me, I was trying to do, and that was a very major problem in the African continent. So for me, it was, how can we make a solution that helps the agriculture without creating a negative carbon footprint? And that was much of a challenge because no one was doing a real solution on the ground at the time. And I felt like now is the time to combine the knowledge I had besides some business skills. So this is the picture of the thing I was talking about. It's combining cold storage with solar. And I would just like to share some of parts of the story that would give us a practical, let's say, some perspective of how can we make solutions on the ground on a very small scale. So the thing is, generally in Africa in general, but Sudan is no different than that, is that most of, let's say, the players in the economy it's based on a large number of smaller farmers. So it was very difficult just to provide them with a solution where they can just have access to that service without having to pay anything up front. So that was an outcome of more than 2 to 3 years, and that would have been done in less than a year because of the lack of the funding. So for me, because I was just passionate about that, I had to, and also coming from the engineering background, it helped me to work on the designs and the product development. But financially, I had to fund everything from my own savings because I believed in that thing. So it was the start, and then one of the good things that happened with me after I was doing, because we started from doing MVP, and then I've done the work with the tomatoes like you have seen. Then I enrolled in a program, and that was an initiative where I wanted to highlight this experience because there was an initiative by the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They wanted to support the agricultural value chain in Sudan, in Africa in general, but Sudan was one of the countries chosen. So they have made a call for application, and I applied and told them my idea and what I was trying to do. So when they have seen like the MVP and the prototype, they eventually I enrolled in a program which lasted like 8 months, and then eventually I received the funding of 25,000 euros. And the thing is, before me enrolling in that program, I tried to reach out for so many investors, but everyone would just tell me like, this is very risky. They know like this is a great idea, but it's risky. How can I fund you? I cannot pay you. You know? Even if I told them it's profitable, let's help the planet, but no one. If you just reach out for even angel investor, they felt it's very risky because, especially in Sudan, like no one was doing something on the ground. So no one have seen something similar, and they felt like maybe it didn't work. So through that program, the moment I received that funding, I was approached by another investor, and I received a matching fund, and that's the outcome. Because when I combined them both, I could build this because this is the commercial unit, and it's capable of running without, even if there was no sun, it would run for 2-3 days, which is now a practical solution. But imagine if we create such a solution and spread it among, because the previous speakers were talking about the economic growth. So if you're trying to achieve any sort of economic growth, you need to engage the small fragmented segment of market players. So you have to provide them with a solution that's very adaptable by them. So you need to give them a solution that they can use. So one of the things also we did is not offering the farmers to purchase. We were offering them access on a pay-as-you-go model. So people now, they use the model, they call it coding as a service. So we just invite the farmers to stack and aggregate their crops in these crates, and then they pay just as much as they have stored. Depends, like up to 2-3 days, and then they pay. So the idea is just providing initial funding brings more funding, and also like the technology has to be on the ground where we help those small people farmers, or even like people who do small businesses, because it's very hard just to import technologies and business models from the global north just to say that it would work, and this is actually very challenging. So for me, the idea and the journey was, how can we build something it can be scaled down to a level where a very small farmer having a holding of 2-3 acres can access the solution and get his life better. Because if I'm thinking from let's say, if I was in that country, I would just I want to make the people's life better, and that would make me more preferring like using cheaper energy sources, which probably is going to have a high carbon footprint. So just for me to wrap up is 4 points. I talked about this: more innovation, R&D, which is, there are so many people who are trying to make, I'm the only one in Sudan, and I'm not the only one in that region, but maybe because some circumstance helped me to come up with that solution. But we need to support more R&D, and by listening to the people who have the technologies, and also helping them by giving them access sometimes to hubs or places where they can develop the technologies. And the second part is the investment, which is just like it was mentioned the last time, like the default rate is very low because people are really keen on growing. So people use the measures and the metrics that they use here in these markets, and they say it's very risky because of no market risk, and this is the problem. But I'm sure, like, because also like living in the entrepreneur community in Sudan is very small. So every single entrepreneur I've met myself, like, were very keen on recovering this investment because they wanted to grow, they wanted to do an impact. So I think I just suggest that people should do more investment in this aspect, and especially investing in younger entrepreneurs, the ones who do the work on the ground, because I don't think it's going to work if we just import technologies and solutions from this part of the world and assume that's going to work. And the third is capacity building by training, providing. I think my example, just having this ability to study MBAs, that's an example, because like I wouldn't be able to afford like having an MBA course, which is expensive for me. So having this chance to come and build my capacity, and I could feel that just being there for 5 months, I could see how much growth I could achieve by just being in Oxford, talking to great people. I'm having like more than one mentor. So this is a great thing that I personally feel like it's very useful. And the last thing is maybe, it's more of an observation, is that as we are trying to create this transition and investment in this developing region, we have to be careful for the responsible use of resources, meaning that we don't have to quickly come up with solutions on a large scale, because sometimes we create, and for example, if I just take the example of Congo now, which is a very rich country in terms of resources, but they're not actually benefiting from the example of, they contribute to the electric cars, but as we do this transition, we're making social, economic problems in Congo. So this is just an observation, because I work with the people and they're very fragile. So I think the best thing is just, it would take you back to the point of working closely hand in hand with the people who are on the ground. So, yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Khalid. Would all four speakers now like to come up onto the stage? And this is the time really to have a discussion, and we'll very much ask for questions from the audience. So if you'd like to come join in. So while you're all thinking of your questions, and I'm sure there are many because we've had 4 really excellent talks and many themes that are coming through time and again, I'd like to sort of take my advantage of being the one in the middle to say, I'd like to ask all of you this question actually, in that we've heard a lot about people not wanting to invest because they're quite risk averse to investing in these sorts of projects at the small and the large scale. And yet we heard about the XPrize, which to me doesn't seem risk averse. It seems that that's such an inspiring, people can really go for it. What can we do about this attitude towards risk and that therefore people not wanting to invest? And maybe, Bayo, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a tricky one, but I think a start point is education, and education especially supported by, or a message that's supported by people that folks are used to talking to, which is part of why we support governments when they are putting together plans like the JETP or the Lagos LCAP, in the sense that if the government says it, based on work that's done by the ministry, maybe they don't believe it, but if we are there beside them and say, look, we've looked at this together, then it's a little bit more believable. So that's one part, but I also think highlighting successes on the ground, like the extremely low default rates that you've seen on the investments that you've done, goes a long way into shifting people's perspective on what it actually means to be investing in Africa. And then maybe the last part, well, Africa or any other emerging country, and then the last part is that sort of the domestic piece that you mentioned. Again, China being extremely successful because it's got a large savings pool and can self-fund many of those innovations. Starting to get African countries, again, I keep coming back to Africa because that's the region I'm most familiar with, to a place where they see themselves not only as recipients of aid in a way, but where we are building the capacity to raise domestic financing, to put our pension funds as well into projects that are linked to sustainability, would be a third aspect that I highlight.
Okay, I want to give the audience time to speak, but I'm just going to come back actually to Anousheh. What I noted with your XPrize, you've got brilliant communication. How much of this comes back to communication as well? I mean, I'd never heard of your projects before, the ones that you were both talking about. And Khalid, I only came across because there is a lovely video on the web. But what can we do about this?
So let me talk a little bit about risk, because communication, it's actually one of the ways you can mitigate risk. And the problem is not like one risk. You have to break it up. So there is renewable energy. In the era of renewable energy, especially when it comes to solar and wind, you don't need to prove that the technology works. So there is no technology risk. It's more of the expectations of investors on the return. So you have greenwashing on the overall title. So there are people who say they want to do impact investment, but when it comes to their investment thesis and you look at their timeline of return on investment, it doesn't match the projects they wanted. So I think there is a shift that needs to happen on making sure that the investors' expectations of return matches the type of projects that they claim they want to invest. So I think that's one thing that needs to be fixed. But when you come to the other areas where it's carbon credit, carbon sequestration, and some of these other technologies that we talked about, there's a technology risk that investors are feeling uncomfortable with, because there's a lot of different programs, but they don't know which one works, which one's scalable. And that's where XPrize, really plays a big role in, mitigating some of that risk, because we do rigorous testing and we publish the result of the testing. So if they want to look at, 1,000 different approaches to this, they can see which ones have been proven and by third-party validation that it works. So we're mitigating some of that risk, so they feel more comfortable investing in those technologies. So we need to look at how we do that, and the way we do it is through communication, through really highlighting the work of these individuals, through publishing about their work, publishing the results of our testing, and then involving a community to come and experience this through the time that it takes to develop the project. So it all has to come together to work together.
Did you want to add anything to that quickly, or should we go for questions in the audience? Right, I'm going to go for questions. I'm sure there will be a number of questions. So anyone like to... Oh, right, there's one just down here. Thank you. Would you like to just introduce yourself when you ask the question as well?
Thank you so much for that. My name is Sugandha. I'm a lecturer at Oxford. My question was on the carbon removal project. Is there some work on how to store that carbon, and over what timescales we'd be assured that the carbon that's captured, whether it's from the ocean or the air, is actually stored and won't leak back out?
Yes, so our fund is 99 years or more, and we validate that through scientific testing of the solution. So if mineralization, you're basically capturing it in a rock formation, which is the most secure way. If you're doing nature-based, which is the most controversial and most difficult ones, you have to look at, in the calculation, you have to include how you mitigate the risk of losing that source that's actually holding the carbon. So that's all part of the how we decide who wins. We're not going to have a winner per each category. We're going to compare them across all of them. My guess is that in the demonstration, you will see some of the more engineered solution having a better chance of winning. However, the energy costs of those solutions are higher. So it's going to be very interesting to see how we select the winners. But I have great, actually, interest in the results coming out soon. The other part that I wanted to also mention with carbon capture is how you compare these different solutions, to your point, and how you make sure that if I'm buying future credits, that it will actually happen. And the work we're doing will give credibility to certain types of solution, so they can use that to actually attract more financing in their solutions.
Question. One at the back here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the amazing presentations. I'm Eric Kume, postdoc with the Leverhulme Center for Nature Recovery. I think for me, when it comes to leaving no one behind, a very important question is who is left behind and why they are left behind. And so in that context, I was wondering if the presenters could share some ideas in various ways how they address issues of equity, such that the new kinds of technologies we produce do not become essentially new mechanisms for even further leaving people behind. So the solution becoming greater than even the problem. Thank you.
Deirdre, would you like to start on that one?
Sure. Look, I think it's such an important question. I also think to some extent, when you talk about carbon and climate, you actually shouldn't have to have the question, because it's the ultimate public good. It's almost unique in the sense that if we in the UK want to stop flooding in Cumbria, what we actually should be doing is make sure we invest to decarbonize Nigeria, right? So we in some ways, the equity, and I think, I'm not saying the equity discussion isn't hugely important and moral and the right thing to say, but we almost don't need to have it, right? Even if you didn't care about a just transition, but you thought there was going to be climate risk that might affect you and your descendants, then the right thing to do is to fund the transition all over the world, right? So as you pointed out at the beginning, in some ways the who caused the problem argument is an argument we don't need to have on mitigation. It's an argument we absolutely need to have on adaptation. And that's where I think it's most important, which is all of the discussions you have at COP on loss and damage. And those are, to your question, those small island nations are the ones that are, the left behind, right? This is about helping nations adapt, who have already, as you talked about, we're already 1.5 degrees, right, last year. So we need to have an equity discussion on adaptation. I actually don't think you need to have an equity discussion on mitigation.
And Khalid, you're going to come in on this.
Does that make sense? That's big. Khalid?
Maybe I share from my experience with working with very small-scale farmers. As we are trying to make this transition, we are already excluding some people who don't have the knowledge and the capacity and the financial ability to adopt these solutions. So when I tried to, because initially I was trying to solve the problem of the post-harvest losses, which is an agricultural problem. But in order to solve that problem, we needed to rely on a climate-smart technology. So the thing is, I wanted to make this solution very accessible for farmers without asking them to do anything other than just bring their crops, and I'll just give them, this is the storage next to you, just bring your crop, and they will just become curious. And I feel like as you are trying to resolve the problem, you are increasing the awareness of the farmers or whoever stakeholders you are working with. And this model can be very easily replicated in terms of electricity, if you want to electrify some villages or some rural areas or provide them with irrigation. So I think, because I'm kind of, maybe I got this chance to be exposed to different geographies, so it's very hard to rely on the models we are successfully seeing here and assume that it's going to work over there, because the demography is different, the financial ability of those people is very different. So we need to collaborate with, that's why I just keep on emphasizing on the work with the young entrepreneurs, because they are the ones on the ground and they are very well educated, they are willing to keep on getting more educated and learning more. And they would be the best people who could help us to make this transition, also include those people, because we cannot just ask them to become climate smart, because they don't know much about that. And to be honest with you and be very frank, at the moment, given the economic challenges they go through, they don't really care. This is the reality.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
On this issue of equity, you have to, again, look at it from a different angle. By 2050, 1 in 4 people will be from the continent of Africa. And we cannot tell these countries not to grow, not to create opportunity for the people, and because we have a climate risk. So that won't work. We can tell them, but there will be upheaval if people don't have jobs, they don't have means of making a living. So we need to balance that out, is to give them opportunities in the sustainable, field of technology, energy, resources, to be able to do that. Now, if we don't do anything, like what you said, we'll have rising sea levels that will create so much problem that we'll have mass immigration. So ultimately, the Western world, the developed countries, will have to deal with mass immigration issues, whether it's water scarcity or high sea levels, that will create some other problems. So if people think smart about long term, they can say, I don't want to invest in dealing with a situation later. Let me invest that money up front, or a fraction of that up front, so I mitigate the risk and don't deal with the problem. Unfortunately, our world leaders are not thinking properly about long term. They're worried about short-term elections.
So, yeah, there's a question here.
My question is really about comparative advantage. In the field of renewable energy, one particular area where the continent of Africa has a substantial comparative advantage over, say, the continent of Europe and the availability of sunshine as. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about some mega solar projects in Africa, and clearly there are big challenges around storage and transmission, but I'd be interested to hear from the panel whether they think this kind of export of energy from solar is a feasible proposition, is something we're likely to see in the medium term. Thank you.
Certainly something I've seen over, I remember the first project, it was the sort of, this must be 15 years ago, they were going to cover North Africa with solar thermal, and that was, which is, you know, not the solar panels we have here, which are semi, but large glass troughs. And I just think it's incredibly, you know, first of all, you have the transmission problem, which is huge. You have energy security, which has become a much, much bigger issue. So I can't see how it could be in any way politically feasible in Europe to say this is going to be our solution. And also, Europe is pretty, you're getting there. You know, you're moving very, very quickly to decarbonize the European electricity grid. The great thing about Africa's solar resource is you need to decarbonize the African electricity grid, not just for today, but for, you know, that's where all the population growth is going to come, that's where all the emissions growth is going to come. So I think it would be a terrible waste of capital to spend the money building the transmission from North Africa to Spain and all the way across Europe, when actually what you need to do is just build a renewable energy and decarbonize the African electricity grid, which is massively coal reliant.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah. Just a small angle to that is that you can move molecules around a little bit more easily. So that could be an option, right? So once we have decarbonized the grids in Africa, or alongside decarbonizing the grids in Africa, there's an export opportunity in transferring molecules, green molecules, ammonia, etc. That can be a new export market for some of these countries.
Very quick response.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, in terms of energy security, I mean, we're not exactly spoiled. We're relying on Russia for gas and other, you know, Middle East and so forth. So I don't think that's necessarily the barrier that you can put it out. The other thing I think is really important is that, you know, it may be a waste, but the creation of that sort of export industry will be a catalyst for development within the continent of Africa, because clearly you're going to be able to export this. You're going to be able to, you know, reinvest.
I think we should have this debate afterwards, because there's so many hands around. Maybe have it over a glass of wine at the end. Laura.
Thank you very much. Laura Rival, working at the International Development Department here in Oxford. It's very exciting, everything that I have heard. Thank you very much for your presentations. What in our department we have been thinking a lot about is the legacies of inequalities that exist in the world, and a lot of them can be traced back to structural adjustment policies made in the 60s and the 70s, i.e. a lot of debt that developing countries have to deal with. And so I wonder whether in any of the work you do, you are taking into consideration how restructuring debt or thinking about capital in ways that deal with these debt legacies would be a source of reducing these inequities. Thank you.
Who'd like to take that?
Well, I can't address equity, debt restructuring, but I can tell you one thing I'm trying to do at XPrize is we do a lot of work with UN agency, we work with World Bank and IFC, and what I've been proposing to them is to, when you are actually creating financing for a project, infrastructure project, for example, in any country, to push them on, maybe give them an advantage to use sustainable materials, sustainable companies and technologies to help these countries leapfrog, actually. We saw how mobile was adapted and developed in Africa and many developing countries, and they didn't have to go through the transition that some of us went through in developed parts of the world. So the same thing can happen on some of these new technologies if the incentives are provided. So one of our competitions in carbon recycling, the two winners were Green Cement Company and Green Concrete. They're not unique now, there's others coming along, but when you do an infrastructure sort of grant, you have a list of these and say, we're going to give you the money, but you have to use one of these 10 solutions that are green. And I think that will start also pushing some of these investment going in the right direction and giving a chance to these types of technology to develop faster.
Deirdre, do you want to add to that?
Sort of related to that, one of the big areas that where blended finance or grant finance is needed is to help retire coal plants. And that is partly related to effectively debt restructuring. So in a lot of developing and emerging markets, you will have a very new fossil fuel fleet and it'll have a lot of debt on it. And no one wants to shut that down, right? Because the assets are new, you will default on the debt, it doesn't make economic sense, but it's clearly the right thing to do from an environmental perspective. And that's where you want the grant money to go. But the problem is the grant money never wants to go near the dirty assets. They want to fund the nice solar projects, which is actually the one piece where it's I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's certainly easier to get private sector money into a well-structured, clean, renewable energy asset, and you should be putting, the World Bank and the IFC money into shutting down taking the debt of the coal plants onto your balance sheet. But it's a very difficult thing to do.
I think there was a question at the back here.
Thank you, Andrew Hagan, one of the alumni from Teddy Hall's Edmund Hall, but also from Singularity University. I now my main job is at Element 2, a hydrogen refueling company, but advise several companies, including Cambridge Carbon Capture. I had a question for Bayo, and I'll come back to that. Just a quick interlude on the export of energy. There are some people where they have curtailed solar and wind that are turning that into hydrogen and moving that around, and they're looking at exports in that way. My question is on hydrogen. You mentioned the green hydrogen. Although I'm a pedant and I won't call anything green, there's nothing that's green. Did you look at golden hydrogen, the natural resources of hydrogen in pockets? For example, Mali was the first pocket that they found, and that's renewing its stock as they use it.
Is it golden or is it white? Because I don't know.
There are different names, but that's why I say natural sources.
Yeah, no, we didn't look at that specifically.
Could you just explain what that is? I think most of us don't know.
Yeah, so I think hydrogen today is made from fossil fuels, typically.
Yeah.
Blue hydrogen is hydrogen from fossil fuels, where you capture the CO2 that's produced, and you bury that underground, and then it's low carbon hydrogen of some form. Green hydrogen is from electrolysis of water, so you split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and you take the water part. So white hydrogen, golden hydrogen is looking for hydrogen resources that are naturally occurring, similar to how fossil fuels are naturally occurring, and just drilling for that directly. And the premise of that is that it's going to be way cheaper than anything we can manufacture. We haven't looked at that specifically for the studies we've done. It's been quite focused on the interactions of the energy system. So renewables with, this countries with renewable potential way bigger than their economies need. And what do you do with all that? And so green hydrogen was very much the focus. But it's certainly an area where I think we are keeping an eye on, because if it does happen that there are commercial quantities of hydrogen that we can just drill for, that would be sort of like a free godsend, a silver bullet. Maybe we should call it silver hydrogen. But because ultimately, if you look at the UK's just finished the hydrogen allocation rounds for electrolytic hydrogen. If you look at the strike price, the average strike price that is being offered, it's something like 9-10 pounds per kilogram. It's like eye-watering. I think white hydrogen will be easily a quarter of that, and we'll see.
There were some questions over here. Was there a hand? If we have a microphone down here, thank you.
Thanks for your wonderful presentations. I'm a civil servant from India, and currently I'm basically a revenue service officer, and currently doing my master's in public policy from Blavatnik School here. So since I come from the policy side, I wanted to know, of course, you mentioned about the role and responsibilities of the emerging markets in decarbonize the entire system. And I wanted to know about your views on the role of environmental taxes and other institutionalized procedures or forms that you can suggest or you have an opinion on for the policymakers to adopt, and also the role and the implications of these environmental taxes in terms of equity and the trade implications for the emerging markets. Thank you.
Would like to, Deirdre? Or?
Yeah, I think, as you say, environmental taxes, they can be difficult to apply, first of all. So the EU is, dealing with this at the moment because you're trying to put on a carbon border tax, which is, for effectively to tax items that are imported into the EU based on their carbon emissions profile, which is intuitively very attractive and almost impossible to implement. So you can do it on steel and aluminium, but once you get to any kind of finished product, it's just incredibly difficult. And I think to some extent, and you saw this in the US, can be used as a sort of excuse for just more tariffs and deglobalization. So I think from an environmental policy perspective, it's a complicated tool. I think the carbon market is also a complicated tool. So I think, India, for example, has done a great job on reverse auctions for renewable energy. Those have been great tools, and the UK's done a great job, right? Taking the cost of offshore wind down from, I think the first auction was 200, and it went all the way, to 250. It'll go up a little bit because of inflation. So that's been a really useful tool in giving industry clear visibility on what they're going to get from their investments, and therefore crowding in money and reducing costs. I think auto standards have been hugely successful. Emission standards on cars, which started in the EU, you have them in India, you have them in China. And that has had the same effect. And I think the problem is that the cost curve for carbon is so steep, right? To have one price is a challenging, it's not necessarily a perfect tool, rather than different scenarios across each different market.
If I may add to that, so I'm a dreamer, and you ask about policy. One thing that we need to shift as policymakers can help. Right now, if a company makes a commitment to decarbonize over a period of time, they look at it as an expense. So they have to justify it. It's a very difficult, proposal internally to the company, because they're all looking at their share value and this is extra cost. But truly what's happening is their investment in decarbonization should not be looked at as a cost, but a risk mitigation in general. And if instead of accounting it as just a sink cost, but and creating value in the shares because they're making this investment, it becomes a different proposition. I think companies will be happy to invest in decarbonizing, and that money they can spend on actually working with a lot of entrepreneurs and implementing this solution. The problem is right now the incentives are not there in the way shareholders look at it. Now consumers are asking for it, but none of these push from the consumers, even from investment community, shows up on the financial statements and balance sheet. So I think there is a change that needs to happen in the way financial sectors looks at share value and the valuation of the companies.
The intangible input of the valuation.
Yes. Yeah.
We've got time for we've got 5 hands up. We've got time for sort of two quick questions. Let's take one from the front here. Let's just take the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Harry. I'm a second year at the University of Kent. We're talking about, I heard the mention of the SAPs and debt in the Global South, I hate that term. But thinking about getting investment into technology and the social side and the social side of sustainability. it's hard enough getting investment for technology, as you said, because there's so many out there. How do you direct it to the ones that matter? Same thing with your problem with communities. They differ within countries, within the same beach, in fishing communities. There's so much variety. How do you incentivize and how do you mitigate the risk of investment into communities? And does it interlink with the same strategies you'd use for technology as well?
Really good question. Khalid, do you want to start on that one? Do you want to have a quick answer to that?
Have to follow up.
Sorry, you'd like to follow up? Who would like to take?
I can maybe address a little bit from, again, XPrize's point of view. The hardest thing to do is for us is to address the human factor, which is the community, and it's based on trust. So a lot of these solutions may work, but if there is no trust in the source of technology, you can't implement it. That's why we work closely with the local communities. We test our solutions in the place where these solutions have to be implemented. We had a global learning competition for educating people from complete illiteracy to being able to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. We ran the test for 18 months in Tanzania with World Food Program and UNESCO as our partners on the ground in remote villages in Tanzania. So creating these partnerships where the solution may have been invented here in a lab in Oxford, but actual implementation and testing and proof of concept is done in partnership with a local partner, creates that trust that will enable the community support.
Khalid, do you want to come in really quickly?
I think the key thing is to rely on social entrepreneurship, which is something that combines the social approach along with the investment approach, but sometimes you might get, let's say, a lower financial income, but you may get a higher social one. So, and also the way that's done is slightly different than the typical entrepreneurship. And I feel like it's quite doable, but the challenge is you need to spend, it's kind of slower, so you need to spend more time understanding the community and the challenges. And you need to really understand, as you mentioned during your question, is to understand the difference between each community. So,
thank you. There's a question at the back.
Hi, thank you for a really wonderful evening so far. My name's Stephanie Niven. I'm an alumni of Merton College, and I also work with Deirdre at 91 on sustainable investing. But I've also had the pleasure to be sandwiched between an 8-year-old and a 13-year-old this evening. So I wondered if I could hear from the panel, perhaps from each of you, just a one sentence on what the next generation should take away. Because I'm sure there's been a lot of new information to both of my fellow members of the audience here, and it'd just be great for a couple of headlines. Thank you.
And actually, that was going to be my question to wrap up. So I think what we're going to do is, if you wouldn't all mind just saying, what we do, what the next generation should be taking away, but also, you made a very good point. There's not one silver bullet, but what would be the one thing you would like to see happen that you think really would move the dial and make sure no one's left behind? So, Bayo, do you want to start on this?
Yeah, tough one. So I've got a 9-year-old, and she's an eco warrior and part of the school eco council. What I basically told her is pick the thing that you care the most about and go full 100% on it. And she cares about recycling and circularity, and that's what she calls us all out on. So.
I think maybe the key thing that really helped me to shift my mindset is to really engage with the ones who are mostly affected by these things, rather than just being in my place. If I'm living in a very good life, I wouldn't feel how other people who actually face the outcomes of the climate change, for example. So if there's a country that's affected, it will be, if they go there and see how people, they will grow some sort of awareness. So to see and experience things with their own eyes.
Young people are digital natives. They have that advantage over us. They think differently. I think we need to empower them. We need to trust them. We cannot tell them, your kids, when you grow up, they can do things now, and we believe in that. So we've created actually a program called XPrize Connect for high schoolers to pick what they're passionate about, and we help them give the tools and skill set and connect them so they can create their own projects at whatever scale. So I think we just need to empower them, and they're much smarter than most of us these days.
So the 13-year-old's my daughter. So I hope you've been behaving yourself. And I think the first thing I would say is, you are the ones who motivate us. So like Bayo, you and your brothers are the ones who were vegan at home in January because of the kids, right? And you want to continue it on through the rest of the year. And then the second is, and I talked about reasons to be cheerful earlier, and I think we sit in a time where there aren't always lots of reasons to be cheerful. And the one thing that the 8-year-olds and 13-year-olds at least give me reasons to be cheerful is you listen to other people. You're interested in the perspectives of all your friends who come from every different part of the world. And as I read the newspaper, I don't see that every day. I don't see people who want to hear the side of the story from a different perspective. And I think for us, as people who really care about climate, that also means listening to the people who don't. So talking to, I'm going to DC next week to meet with some of the people who are going to work on the Trump team.
Yeah.
So talking to the people who violently disagree with us and trying to see their perspective, I think would be something I think the digital natives do better sometimes than we do.
I'm going to stop there. There are drinks, so we can continue the conversation, but I just want to say a huge thank you to all 4 members of the panel. I've come away from this feeling very inspired. I was expected to be very depressed, and I actually think there are nuggets of real hope and positivity in everything you've said. So thank you very much for giving us your perspectives, and if we can all join to say thank you.